Mark Lerner of Great Bear Enterprises Astrology. Welcome to Nature of Reality Radio. I heard about you from that recent interview you did with Rex Bear of the Leak Project, where you talked about, among other things, the green comet that has approached Earth recently, and also Halley's Comet and other things. And Halley's Comet is very significant in my life, and I'll get into that briefly, and maybe you can touch on that as well, and all that. But first. Thank you for calling me as soon as I send my message. You're like the first person ever who's I say, please, would you like to come on my show? And then less than 2 minutes after,
Right.
I get a phone call. So, and there were some things you said in that phone call that made me led to believe that this was a synchronistically meant to happen interview. And we'll probably get touch on that as we get along. So, without further ado, I might as well point that out. You said that your daughter's car was stolen and you had to call the police. Interestingly, you told me that the same day you called me, and shortly before you called me, I had the police come to my house because some ghost or entity or spirit caused the alarm system to go off in my parents' house. I live
Yeah.
in the garage apartment, so that was kind of interesting. And
Yeah.
some of the things that you were talking about in your interview with Rex Bear pertain to me, like Halley's Comet and all, and that green comet. Like I said, I wonder if it means that the green Eagles and not the red Chiefs will win the Super Bowl. We don't know. It's only a guess. I hope they do. I hope, because I'm from the Philly suburbs. But
Yeah.
anyhow, let's talk about some serious stuff now. Mark Lerner, who are you? What did you experience that caused you to want to be an astrologer? And most importantly, please silence the skeptics and
Yeah.
give us all the info that you can to show and confirm and make it clear that astrology is not a joke. It is not a quack science. It is a genuine, real science that anybody is worth following because it really is for real.
Okay. All right. So here's the condensed version. Thank you very much for having me on your show. So, born and raised in New York City, son of a doctor, Jewish family. I'm now 72. And when I went to college at Michigan State, was pre-med, 6 weeks later, pre-law, realized I was not wanting to be a doctor, became a social science, sociology major, got out of college, didn't know what I was going to do. Then I started taking some classes at Columbia University, possibly to be an English teacher or majoring, do something like with a master's degree in English. That didn't work. And then I thought maybe I'd go back to college, to medical school, and start taking medical classes. This is kind of the key. So I started taking chemistry at Columbia University. I was 22. And on the way home, back in the borough of Queens, same borough where our former president was born 4 years before me, I went into a bookstore. And lo and behold, I found a book called Astrology, the Space Age Science. I didn't know anything about astrology, except for what anybody, sort of understands on the basic level, sun signs, this and that. And I started browsing through the books. I saw the title was very interesting, Astrology, the Space Age Science. What is this all about? Started flipping through it, and the bottom line I learned was that physicists and astronomers like Copernicus, who was the person in the 1500s, said it's the sun that is at the center of the solar system, not the Earth. And as a kid, I loved astronomy. And then I start reading, oh, by the way, according to this astrologer who's writing this book, Astrology, the Space Age Science, not only was Copernicus an astrologer as well as an astronomer, but so was Johannes Kepler. He's the one who discovered about ellipses, that the Earth goes around the sun in ellipses. That was after Copernicus. Then Galileo, who got us all our telescopes, he was also an astrologer. And the greatest scientist before Sir Isaac Newton, before Einstein, was Sir Isaac Newton. And he was also an astrologer who also studied magic and alchemy and so on. And this was all in this book, so I bought the book. And there's also about earthquakes and planets like Uranus and Neptune, these outer planets that had been discovered 1781, 1846, being overhead in certain areas and causing earthquakes. So I started reading the book. I was absolutely fascinated. Then got another book or two, and I was on my way to becoming a professional astrologer. One more other thing about the beginning was I'd already started to sort of get into things like the tarot, metaphysics, Edgar Casey, America's Sleeping Prophet, picked up a book on him, Rudolf Steiner, who was a great psychic from Austria in the late 1800s, early 1900s, reading a lot about spiritual things. But I didn't get into the astrology part of it until that particular book, and then later that year, and a whole bunch of other things happened. And that started me on the road for the last 51 years of being a professional astrologer. Now here's the key. Okay, you asked about this. This is really important about the skeptics. I was not only on, and thanks to Rex Bear on the Leak Project, been on there a lot of times, and I've also been on Coast to Coast with George Norrie for 18 years. So I'm often, in fact, I was on Coast to Coast on New Year's. And somebody wrote me, as often I get, an outrageous letter. You know, it was an astronomer who said, you guys are all con men. There's no way on Earth, Jupiter or Saturn, they're hundreds of millions of miles away, and you make clients, you get all this money as if, like, the planets can actually influence you. It's outrageous. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. At any rate, this is the big problem of either astronomers or anybody who thinks that astrologers believe, which we don't, okay, that Saturn, Jupiter, Neptune, the Sun, the Moon, or anything else is doing something to us. Okay, now, yeah, the Moon, the Sun, they influence tides, they influence the Earth, they're effects of the whole solar system. The way astrology works, okay, is that you and I and everybody listening, okay, or seeing all this, we're all born at a moment of time, okay, and at that moment of time, in that place, that longitude and latitude, there's a pattern of the Sun, the Moon, 8 planets, and whatever else you want to put in a chart. For ages, there were like fixed stars and constellations and so on. And so when you take your first breath, that is kind of like your spiritual life mission. So it's not that Jupiter's doing anything to you, but that Jupiter has various archetypes and themes. So does the Sun, so does the Moon, so does Saturn. And over several thousand years, we understand what these archetypes are, and then we live them out, because the chart is kind of like our blueprint for who we are and what we're trying to do. And one final thought is I believe we're all souls and spirits having human and personality lives, so that people understand where I'm coming from. And I do believe, I don't like to force anybody from a religious or philosophical standpoint, that we've lived many, many times and we will live again. And I guess I would say my philosophy is mostly Taoist and Buddhist on that particular level, about what I believe, how it sort of all works, it comes together. Not that I was born Jewish, I studied Christianity, Islam, all the different religions, but I guess if anybody wants to peg me, I'd say I'm sort of on the Taoist Buddhist level. So that's my basic rendition here.
Thank you. And your website, you call it Great Bear Enterprises. Anything significant about the constellation Ursa Major that makes it worthy
Yes.
of why it's the
Yep.
title of sorts of your website?
Well, it goes back to, I was fortunate enough to work at a sort of a esoteric center called the Alice Bailey Lucis Trust next to the United Nations back in 1974-76, and some things happened. I was able to then go to Findhorn, a community in Scotland, in northern Scotland. They'd been founded in 1962, no gurus. There were leaders there, but it was a very intuitive educational community. They just celebrated their 60th anniversary. And it was there that I got a book called The Ancient Wisdom, and I've got a copy of it right here, by an amazing writer, Jeffrey Ash. And the whole book was about the 7 stars of what we call the Big Dipper out of the Great Bear constellation. And as a northern constellation, you know, we're all familiar, it's often called the Big Plow. Mostly in America, we call it the Big Dipper. And in my own birth chart, in fact, the planet Jupiter, this is the largest planet, happens to be what we call rising in Aquarius, and all the degrees of the zodiac, in other words, a lot of people out there are going to be thinking, well, I'm a Leo, you know, what is he talking about, or I'm a Taurus. So, unfortunately, sun sign astrology is not real astrology. It was manufactured about 90 years ago by newspapers in America and England and Europe to make money, because newspapers were like a penny or two, and they were looking for something. What can we get, you know, how can we get people to sort of buy our paper? Well, astrology was sort of coming into its own. Astrology had been taught, you know, for like the last couple of thousand years, and it was taught at universities in Europe 1,000 years ago. But it was kind of an astrology-astronomy mix, okay? So most people, unfortunately, think, oh, well, I'm a sun sign, this or that. People weren't walking around 200 years ago or 400 years ago thinking I'm a Leo or anything. It was only like kings, queens, and people like that. There were court astrologers, people like Nostradamus doing those charts. Otherwise, this whole sun sign astrology, it's not wrong. Okay, it's just very, very basic, and we get a lot of incomplete ideas without looking at the whole birth chart.
Thank you. And when it comes to which types of astrology are worth using, I guess I'll ask you to which one is your one of choice, and can you maybe compare them and explain why the one that you have as your astrology of choice is the one that you chose and not the other ones. What I'm talking about is tropical Western astrology, which is path the sun across the ecliptic. You got Vedic sidereal astrology, which they use in India, and then there's the Chinese zodiac, and then there's also I recently found out about Celtic astrology, and I found out that in Celtic astrology I am the fox and the bear. Yeah, I wonder how I have two signs there, but I do. And I am also an Aries, a Pisces in sidereal, and a tiger. And well, I also think I should ask you, do you think it is in everybody's best interest that wants to follow astrology? Should you look at every single one of those horoscopes all at once in one day and try to make sense of everything? Or is that kind of too complicated? You should really maybe just pick one astrology of choice one day, pick another one the next day, and so as not to complicate things and try to jumble many different horoscopes into one. So a lot of questions there, but you get where I'm going with this.
I'll make it real simple. I've done this for 51 years. I've learned from the greatest astrologers. On my website, if people are interested, years ago, with a small group of people, I created 36 one-hour classes with less audio classes, 1 hour, lesson notes, and charts. It still exists. My daughter changed everything from cassette tapes to CDs, and now it's MP3 files. The thing is that the problem with things like Vedic astrology or constellational astrology out of India, it's all, for American astrologers or European astrologers, this is what I rail against. Astrology is very logical, mathematical, and scientific. The problem is that so many astrologers get into it somewhat and don't get deep enough. If I have a person's month, day, and year of birth and time, as long as I have their time, like from a birth certificate or something very close to exact, within a couple of minutes, and their month, their place, longitude, latitude, all I can tell everybody out there listening is you don't need Vedic astrology. You don't want to complicate things by getting into constellations versus what we call the signs of the zodiac. Unfortunately, our zodiac, what we call, like you said, tropical, which is what's used and has been used for hundreds of years in America and Europe, is perfectly fine. And now, instead of having older, what we call ephemerides, where the positions of the sun, moon, 8 planets, well, they didn't have 8 planets because Uranus wasn't discovered till 1781, Neptune 1846, Pluto 1930. The other thing is, when I got into this, Andrew, in New York City 51 years ago, a woman named Eleanor Bach brought us the first asteroid ephemeris from what we might call now the goddesses of Ceres, Pallas, Athena, Juno, and Vesta. They are little planets in the asteroid belt. And this was 20 years after William Herschel found this planet, Uranus, in 1781, at the end of the American Revolution. Now the astrology I work with is, I've done thousands of charts for people, and I also have been in the field of what we call mundane or earth astrology of world leaders and eclipses and new moons, and you mentioned, green comets and Halley's Comet, things that are astronomical, things that are astrological. But for your audience out there, this is all fascinating. We just had the Chinese Lunar New Year. But this kind of astrology is like, oh, well, this is the year of the rabbit. So then there's a metal rabbit and an earth rabbit and different things depending on which 12-year cycle. I happen to be born in the year of the tiger. But to think that astrology would be like every single soul that incarnates, and by the way, every day there's about 250,000 babies that are born in the world of this year, that they're all rabbits and they're all going to identify, that's absurd, okay? I'm not saying that there aren't some qualities for the entire 12 months, but that's not real astrology. Now, there is another Chinese astrology underneath all of that, and that would take a lot of work. I'm not familiar with all of that, okay, and I think very few people in the West are. The Vedic astrology deal, though, is where a lot of European and American astrologers think, oh, that's the one that's correct. And part of the problem is they have a lot of Indian terms, Rahu, Ketu, these other things, and it's very exotic to do that. But that's not more accurate. And here's the real problem, as I see it, with using the constellations, okay, which is what they do. They're not equal. They're different sizes, okay? What we have in the West is a very scientific mathematical model. Unfortunately, it has the same names, Aries, Taurus, and so on. What happens is on the first day of spring in the northern hemisphere, which is March 20th or March 19th, depending on the year, the sun will go into what we call the first 30-degree sector, which we name Aries. Now, over in Vedic astrology, they might be dealing with a star group or a constellation, and their whole thing is different because they're dealing with unequal constellations, and then that becomes very confusing. I'm not saying people can't explore that field, okay? There's a long history of Vedic astrology, but here's the other thing. It's not just astrology. It's what we call progressions, transits, midpoints, solar returns, all these different things that we now have with computers in Western astrology. So, again, if somebody orders a reading from me and they say, I want not just my natal reading, but I want to know about my transits and progressions, I'm going to give them a very thorough interpretation. But here's the other thing. I need to get information from people, okay? I'm not going to sit and as if this is a crystal ball that I'm going to predict their future, because no real astrologer can do that, okay? Astrology is not being psychic. It's a logical, mathematical understanding of the birth chart of one's potentiality to fulfill their life mission. And we have both destiny and fate through the chart and what I call free will. And what I call free will is not you can do anything you want. It's we can't control what happens to us, but we can always control our response to what happens to us. Because I get a lot of people, Andrew, who say, oh, so you believe in that astrology stuff where you don't have any free will, okay? And there is also a difference according to Carl Jung, who is a psychotherapist, as many of you know out there, and he was fabulous. He also studied dozens of married couples, and he sort of brought up an idea, which is what we don't fulfill as our destiny returns to us as our fate, as if destiny and fate are not the same thing. So destiny is more like the higher energies in our birth chart, and fate is like when our intuition is lacking or we're fearful or whatever, something may happen because we didn't sort of go ahead and sort of utilize our intuition at the right time in the right place with the right state of consciousness.
Well, thank you. You have an interesting take on it. Just forget about the Vedic. You don't need it. It's not even worth it, even if you're okay. Well, all right.
Well, not totally. Look, somebody can get into it, but explore Western tropical astrology till the cows come home.
And how about Chinese? Chinese astrology. I can't help but ask you about it.
Well, really again, it's ridiculous to think that everybody now in the year of the rabbit, right, is going to have all those qualities, don't you think? I mean, just think of it logically. I mean,
not necessarily. I mean, well, consider this. A lot of people were the guy who was the president before Joe Biden, which I probably shouldn't say his name because of the algorithms and all, but he was born on the day of a lunar eclipse, and everybody thinks it seems to interpret that likes him seems to interpret that as a sign that he's a savior. Well, how many other people were born that same day? Who are they all having some sort of a unique, crazy, profound life just because they were born on the day of a lunar eclipse? No, but that eclipse still in some way or shape or form factors into their reading, even if they don't have a household name. So I don't know if that helps to make sense of this, but
no.
But what?
Okay, well, let's go backwards a second. You brought up a favorite topic of mine because I've studied Donald Trump's chart backwards and forwards. And the point is, you're totally right. He is born on the day of a total lunar eclipse, but that's just the beginning of things. When he was born on that day, the planet Jupiter, which is the largest planet in the solar system, was what we call stationary. It was not moving. Okay, Jupiter is, according to the work I've done, the ruling planet of the United States birth chart from July 4th, 1776. Personally, I'm not a supporter of the former president. But I've studied most of the president's charts. This is part of what we call mundane or Earth astrology: world leaders, eclipses, seasons, new moons, green comets, Halley's Comet, kind of how astronomy and astrology come together. But the point is that what you didn't bring up is, like, I mean, I don't know in 1946 what Chinese sign he is for that year, but you're right. There's 250,000 babies approximately born every day, approximately. So in 1946, when the former president was born, he was born at a very significant day, a total lunar eclipse. But look, how many people have become president of the United States? His chart, as it connects up to what I call July 4th, 1776, in Congress, the beginning of America's chart, most astrologers work with that, not all of them. So his chart, not just Jupiter, but like you said, his sun sign is Gemini, his moon is Sagittarius, and there was a total lunar eclipse. For instance, Kamala Harris, the current vice president, she's born on the day of a full moon, and her full moon is even more exact than his total lunar eclipse in terms of exactitude of alignment. Now, whether she would ascend to the presidency is very much unknown. But the point is, all of these people, whether it's George Washington, Joe Biden, Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy, all these people, this is what I've studied from the macrocosmic standpoint to understand why do these individuals, regardless of whether they're good people or not, whether they're high-minded or low-minded or somewhere in the middle, why do they wind up becoming like a president? Like, why did Nixon become president after he went through the whole kind of disgraceful thing? Well, I mean, before he even went into the Watergate thing. But he was sort of out, after JFK and losing the governorship. This is a long time ago, 1962 in California, and he then said to everybody in the public, well, you've now gotten rid of Richard Nixon because, this is my last press conference. 6 years later, he makes a comeback, becomes president. Then he goes through the whole Watergate thing, and we think like, well, now there's never going to be any more like impeachments and judicial things until, a couple of years ago. So we never know who we're going to get, but or Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy, Obama, Joe Biden, and so on. Hopefully at some point, I believe we'll have a woman president at some point, although it's been close, it didn't happen. But there are reasons for that. America, when it was born in July 4th, 1776, has a very powerful, shall we say, male-dominated chart. There's a prominent Saturn, there's a prominent Sun, and the moon, which has a lot to do with feminine concerns, is at the toward the bottom of that chart in the sign Aquarius. So, however, we have a person like Kamala Harris who has ascended to the vice presidency, regardless of what people think, and she's very connected to that moon of the U.S. chart. So she's made it to that point, but whether she goes further, who knows?
Thank you. And let's talk about what's going on in the present day now, and there seems to be a lot pertaining to comets. The green comet that, I don't know if it's still visible, but it was recently.
Yeah.
And I said, I hope that comet is an omen that the Philadelphia Eagles, who wear green, and not the Kansas City Chiefs, who wear red,
Right.
will win the Super Bowl this Sunday. I'm from the Philly suburbs, so naturally, you know who I'm rooting for. Oh, interesting fact. I thought I'd point this out. Maybe you can help make sense of this. When the Eagles won the Super Bowl, their first ever Super Bowl back in February 2018, shortly before that, their head coach Doug Peterson celebrated his 50th birthday. Well, his 50th birthday was the day of the new moon that began the Chinese New Year of the Dog, and that new moon was actually a total solar eclipse. That kind of, when I saw that, I was like, wow, it's almost like the stars are destined to have the Eagles win this Super Bowl because their head coach has an extremely significant 50th birthday when he becomes a half centenarian, and it's got a solar eclipse, and it's a Chinese New Year, and it was the year of the dog. And those Eagles back in that year, they were all crazy about being the underdogs. It was so appropriately fitting, and I thought the gods must want them to win the Super Bowl, and well, that was what happened. But I mean, I don't know if you want to say anything about that before you get into the comet thing, but this green comet, what is the significance of it? It's interesting that Halley's Comet, you did mention Mark Twain was born at the beginning of when Halley's Comet came. I was born in April of 1986 when Halley's Comet was visible, and I intend to make a mission out of seeing it before I pass away.
Right.
Interestingly, in this upcoming December, Halley's Comet will actually be, it would have been 38 years since 19, well, not, no, no, not 38, 37 and a half or so. It will
Right.
actually be at its farthest point away from the Earth before
Okay.
it starts moving back. And I wonder what
Yeah.
could possibly be the significance of that. Bo Polney, by the way, the biblical prophecy guy, he actually hinted that he seems to think a stock market crash of monumental proportions. The end of this bear market, it will end in terrible fashion, is seems to be set to happen in December. Well, we've heard that before. I don't know what you can make of it, but it's funny that that's when Halley's Comet will be at its farthest point from the Earth before
Okay.
it starts hitting closer again. So, all right, I've said a lot here. You can you got the
Yeah.
floor. What do you have to say about all this?
Okay, well, the green comet is, yeah, it just sort of made its maximum closeness to the sun and the earth in the northern hemisphere, and I think in several more days or whatever than people in the southern hemisphere. But it isn't like, okay, when you were born in 86, this is nothing to take away from your birth. Apparently, from the astronomical view, it wasn't the brightest, okay? That doesn't matter. It's just that, it has to do with, like, how sometimes it's brighter than others. And again, it's true that so this comet is also a periodic comet, but it's a 50,000-year cycle. You see, now not a 76-year cycle. And Halley's comet was named after Edmund Halley, but he died before it was named after him. It's not like he discovered it and decided, hey, let's name it after me. He passed away, but he's the one who did the research, and so it's named after him. That's how we get the name Halley's Comet. He was an astronomer, physicist, and so on. And by the way, in the field of astrology, there's a saying, Sir Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley. Edmund Halley was pure astronomy. Sir Isaac Newton, as I said, was an astrologer into magic, biblical prophecies, all kinds of things, like which were really fascinating and unusual. And there's a saying by astrologers. They apparently had a conference at one point, and Halley thought that astrology was bunk, but he hadn't studied it. So Sir Isaac Newton said to him, this is like what most astrologers know, like as a sort of aphorism, "Sir, I have studied the subject and you have not." And so this is like a classic thing in astrology, because you get religious, people in churches thinking astrologers are like witches and crazy loons, who are tool of the devil, and you get scientists and like my own dad early on, until he sort of got into what I was doing and realized, I was onto something with the scientists and the astronomers. The scientists also think, they say, I can't believe a smart person like you would believe in a pseudoscience. So I've spent 51 years, you see, on the razor's edge between people who are very religious and scientific, thinking what I'm doing is preposterous and ridiculous. The thing is, when there was Hale-Bopp, there was Shoemaker-Levy, which plunged into Jupiter. We've learned that Jupiter, its enormous size and magnetism, to bring in the science here, is basically a comet catcher. And part of the whole thing is, and this may shock people, human beings are part of the whole solar system. This is the philosophy with Edgar Cayce, Rudolf Steiner, where I worked before Findhorn, the Tibetan Master DK, Alice Bailey, the Theosophical Society, and many other spiritual organizations, that humanity is part of the solar system. When you watch things like Ancient Aliens, you get the same kind of feel, right? ETs, UFOs. By the way, I've used astrology to study the birth of flying saucers, Mount Rainier, Kenneth Arnold sighting, exact time of how we got the term flying saucers came out of that. That was 2 weeks before Roswell. I've done all these different podcasts. A lot of these are all complimentary at Great Bear Enterprises. It's something called Mark Lerner Astrology Radio, Astroscope. So they're all complimentary there. There's a lot of stuff that people can buy, but there's a lot of complimentary stuff. So, the thing is, this is all very fascinating. And I believe that, the whole thing with ETs, UFOs, the pyramids, Stonehenge, all of these things this is all combined, and unfortunately, and thankfully for the show you're doing and so many other people, beginning to dislodge, the sort of, again, the stuff on astrology, which is like, sun sign or Chinese. They're all fascinating, but Western astrology, right, utilized well, with birth times, accurate information, and working with what we call progressions and transits, the ephemerides, the exact positions, and adding on the four main asteroids, a little planet called Chiron, which you may have heard of, and people out there discovered in 1977. And now we have other planets beyond Pluto. There's what's called Sedna and Eris, Quaoar, and so on. There are real planets with real orbits in our solar system, and they've always been there. But as we discover them, they become archetypes in our own birth charts as part of like why we're here and what we're here to do. And sometimes in readings, I will bring them up if people are interested.
Okay, and everybody's got their own different reading. Everybody has a unique thing, and of course, it's you're supposed to make the they're supposed to make the interpretations after they get the reading from you, and you're not really supposed to give them the. I presume they not really give them the what you interpret. You just give the forecast and leave the interpretation up to them, just like with tarot reading and all that.
Well, if somebody asks me, if they ask me specific questions, you see, here's the thing. If somebody says, when might such and such be an opportune time? Those could be answered. Okay, when questions, because we can look ahead and see where the planets are moving, and then if the person utilizes the planet well, they can have an auspicious energy depending on how they ask the question. This is what I call Zen astrology. At one point I did a whole calendar on that. It's how you ask the questions to the astrologer to get the right answers. So when questions, what might happen around such and such alignment, that can be looked at. How might I, develop something more auspicious or whatever at a certain point in time? All those can be answered. Here's what can't be answered, I believe. Will I meet a tall, dark stranger? Will I come into a whole lot of money? You know what I mean? These are the things that don't make any sense, because it's like it all depends on what you want to do. Like now with relationships, okay, if somebody stays at home because of COVID, or they're fearful, or they don't want to socialize because of whatever it is, then you're going to be much less likely, if you're looking for a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or whatever, your social life is going to be very minimal. But if you're on Match.com, you see, and you put yourself out there, then you're going to have more of an opportunity for something good to happen on a social level. See what I mean? So everything, I'm just giving an example of the how questions, the what questions, the why questions. But when people start saying, will this happen? Again, it's a mixture of destiny in your chart, where you have your celestial bodies and where they're moving, transits and progressions, and what level of free will. Okay, you can't control everything that happens to you, but your response to what happens to you is under your control. You can fall apart. You can be brave. You can be more courageous. You can go forward. You see what I mean? Depending, so many people fall apart when things get tough. And then, the old saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. So this all has to do with qualities in a person's birth chart. How many fire signs, how many earth signs, where's the sun, where's the moon, where are the planets, to see how you stack up when things get difficult or things get easier.
Right. All right, maybe a couple more questions before I make this pay-per-view. Switching gears, digressing from astrology for the moment, you and Rex Bear seem to inadvertently get into a little bit of a debate when you were on his show about Christopher Columbus and all, and I can't help but bring this up because I was actually in elementary school in first grade when we were celebrating the 500-year anniversary of Columbus discovering America, and it was a travesty in so many ways. For one, he didn't discover America, and frankly, I don't even think the Vikings did either. I think the Chinese were probably in America before them, and there's also the Kensington Runestone, which has the date 1362 on it, which suggests the Knights Templar were in America around that time. And you were saying that you think he was trying to find India to get spices, and he actually landed in America. Rex Bear was trying to assert, no, Columbus, he knew America was there. He was actually connected to the Knights Templar. His ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, all had the Knights Templar cross on it. And he also, in his signature, had a hooked X, which suggested that he was connected to the Knights Templar, because that hooked X is like a Knights Templar in-your-face symbol. And the thing that made the whole travesty about when I was in elementary school, we were celebrating the 500-year anniversary the thing about
Yeah.
Columbus, he was a despicable man. He actually had an agenda to kill as many Native
Yeah.
Americans as possible after he found out that the Americas were new. I'm
Yeah.
sure he knew they were inhabited, and he wanted to kill them all to further the empire at the time of the Illuminati. Dare I use that word? But no doubt that Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain were the king and queen, so they
Yeah.
must have been connected to the Illuminati in some way, as was Columbus. So I just can't help but bring this up. Do you think maybe, okay,
Okay.
maybe you were believing a lie and all, and it was worth, and he did actually do what people like David Icke say he did. He knew America was there. He was going to kill the natives and further the empire.
Well, I'm not sure. Let's put it this way. I'm not sure when we had that discussion exactly why it was all brought up or his point. But the thing is, all these so-called conquistadors, right? You got Columbus, you got Pizarro, from grade school, right? You got Cortez, okay? You got all of these navigators, right? Henry the Navigator, all these people who, come out of this tradition where you have all of these myths that the earth is flat, right, supposedly. And then you got Vikings, you got all these different people. But what that is not really astrology, you know what I mean? That's people visiting this area, and then having their agendas, you got Columbus, who's basically, if I remember the whole thing, he's Italian, right, supposedly. He's flying for Spain, right, under, Queen, Ferdinand and, Isabella. So you get these stories, whether they're, accurate or not. He's got the ships and whatever's going on there. Now, the thing is that the story that we hear is something like he's trying to get to a passageway, like to get to India, spices, all of these other things. Now, is that true or not? But that doesn't really have anything to do with astrology per se, except that you get like a guy named Amerigo Vespucci, right, another explorer. This is supposedly how we get the name America out of all of this. And you get all these different explorers, because that was always a fascinating thing in grade school, right, all these different explorers coming over, Vasco da Gama, people going around the world, people coming to America, people afraid of leviathans and falling off the sea and whatever it is, because like not all these sailors, regardless of Columbus or Pizarro or Cortez or different people, da Gama and so on, they're finding all these unusual things, passageways here and there, and then there were all these other explorers inside America, there was one, DeSoto and so on, and these other people with the Mississippi and, the Fountain of Youth, all that stuff, right? So all of these Europeans are coming over to this area and going to looking a passageway around the world. So that just goes back to grade school and all that stuff. Meanwhile, there's all these Native American, different tribes, all living in the Americas, both in North Canada, right, North America, Central America, South America, who have been here for a long periods of time, and they have their whole spiritual traditions, right? And then Europeans are coming over and checking all this out and often doing some really bad things in the Americas, right? So astrology, though, you see, there are all these dates, 1492, I think Verrazano was 1524, and so on. You get all these historical dates when all these things are happening. But by and large, the astrology that we deal with sort of comes into play more with the American Revolution and the discovery of the planet Uranus or Uranus in 1781, after the American Revolution, 1776. And at that point, when Uranus is discovered, it's the first planet beyond Saturn, and this shocks the whole world, you see. And then that starts all these other things like discovering Neptune in 1846, Pluto in 1930, and again, what we call the asteroids, Ceres, Pallas, Athena, Juno, and Vesta, they're discovered from 1801 to 1807. So, and those are little planets between Mars and Jupiter. You see, and now we know there are hundreds of those. So there's all these discoveries, and in charts, you see, we work with the four main asteroids, and we work with also now outer planets, like planets called Eris and Sedna. which are beyond Pluto, and other planets are all part of natal charting now. So it's a wide field, but whatever happened back with the whole Columbus thing, right? That time period, I mean, there's going to be all these disputes that'll come up about, what happened and who was flying for what flag and, what really happened and what was their intent.
Right. And as far as see, I lost my train of thought here. Oh yes. Apparently, in the future, great things there seem to be in store for humanity. Some people that have looked at the future of astrology say that everything seems to be destined for better things for humanity, even if there may be a little bit of chaos in the near future to deal with it. One notable thing about that, I'd like to maybe talk about this for a bit. Actually, before we do this point, this is the pay-per-view onwards part of this show. All folks, listeners, please who want to listen to this to the end, please subscribe on Patreon to listen to the rest of this program.
Okay.
With that said,